Thank you to Pendax Medical for sponsoring today's Endoscopy News podcast. This week we have a chat with Neil Shepherd, Professor of GI Pathology at Gloucester, on the topic of serrated polyps. We joined the conversation when I'm expressing relief that the adenoma detection rate is becoming a thing of the past. We no longer need to spend weeks correlating endoscopy with histology. Now, of course, we will continue to do this to get better at our diagnostic skills and to make sure that no malignant polyps are forgotten about, I guess. We've heard from Gloucester for many years that what you need to do is chase after the histology of every polyp you removed to calculate your adenoma detection rate, which takes, I think in Leeds we remove about 2,000 polyps a year. So that's hundreds of hours spent. But now we don't need to, because it doesn't really matter if they're adenomatous or serrated. They're all polyps. What did you mean by intermediate time? Well, it means exactly what I said, I think, Neil. It means that they're too slow to move up the crypts. So to summarize, what you're saying is it's the things that matter is the number of serrated polyps and the size of them and the location of them. Those three things matter. Well, interesting you say that, Neil, because I was trained in the kudos classifications. On my histopathology request form, I would write down tubular adenoma, tubular-villus adenoma. And it's uncanny that the histopathologist will then look very careful to disprove me. So if I said TVA, they would inevitably say it's a TA. But villus makes a little bit of a difference. If it's a villus adenoma, it's more likely to turn cancerous. For the future, yeah. On the topic of serrated adenoma, it's reasonably easy, I think. I need to remove everything which looks serrated, which is 10 millimeter or bigger, both in the left and the right. But the thing that would make me a little bit more anxious would be if dysplasia is then reported histologically. Presumably, that is the other feature which is of importance. I find it hard to understand how we already mentioned the BRAF mutations. So they're going along a different kind of cancerous pathway. But then you're saying it just kind of could jump and go down the KRAS path. It makes no sense. Well, we might both be out of a job in the future because AI is coming. My endoscopic image could be AI'd and they can find lesions and maybe even characterize the lesions and say that's a villus adenoma. Presumably the same thing is lurking around the corner for histopathology. There's a lot still unknown on the topic of serrated polyps, isn't it? You mentioned serrated polyposis syndrome, and I found myself thinking serrated polyposis syndrome if I have a young patient with these big kind of plaque-like SSLs, but also adenomatous polyps. But another interesting thing on that topic is that all the polyposis syndromes you mentioned, you get polyps throughout the GI tract. But in polyposis syndrome, you only get them in the colon, which is odd, isn't it? You would have thought if it's genetic, why wouldn't you get them in the stomach? I believe you're a co-author of the BSG guidelines on serrated polyps. There it says that we should refer our patients with possible serrated polyposis syndrome to the geneticists, which seems completely useless because the geneticist can't say anything because there is no marker to go by. But there's no way to look at a colorectal cancer and deduce that this particular colorectal cancer did arise from a serrated precursor.
and we try to think about it more and more and more, is just making the procedure and then the histology more tailored to the person. Is this person going to die of colorectal cancer? Should I be taking off the polyp? But with the serrated polyps, it's even more important. If you've got a younger patient with lots of smaller polyps, we should be removing them. We should be cold snaring them and trying to clear them off. It becomes more complicated with colitis because there are hundreds of little white buttons throughout the colon with high definition chromoendoscopy. So I suppose one question I'd have is, should we take them all off, all these lesions? Are you happy to receive them all? And should they be all just come in one polyp trap and one gallipot together, or should we really be mapping them throughout the colon? Because that's almost a non-starter if there are so many polyps. But
in these, we've had a couple of early cancers in colitis. What is the link there? Quite often when I remove adenomatous polyp from the right hemicolon in particular, the submucosa is very greasy. And I've had quite a lot of cases when the histopathologist is wondering if there was an underlying lipoma. And it's just the greasy submucosa. There's no lipoma as such. So when you say collision polyp, that simply is a hyperplastic polyp and an adenomatous polyp developing by chance next to each other, and they bump into each other. is there anything I should do to make your job easier? Have you got any feedback for me? And of course, the payback is that no longer does the histopathology take a month to come back. We'll get us back pretty quickly now, within 10 days. Earlier in the conversation, you didn't sound like you were a convert for discard. The concept that little polyps that doesn't matter if it's serrated or adenomatous, we're just going to remove them and discard them. They don't need histological analysis. Do you believe in this concept? I remember having a conversation many years ago when I was called up to speak to a professor of histopathology here in Leeds who said, Dr. Rembacken, as a registrar, I'm not very pleased with your request forms. You see, here you wrote active colitis. That's all wrong. You say red mucosa, and I say active colitis. Now, thanks, Neil, for a brilliant discussion on much, much more than just serrated polyps. We finish our discussion on that shoreline between the sea of pathology which the endoscopist can diagnose and that landmass of what still requires the pathologist and his microscope. But Neil, the sea level is rising and your island is shrinking. Now, be that as it may, thanks for listening, and I look forward to catching up with you again in a couple of weeks' time when we will discuss anal cancer. That's another pathology which we shouldn't miss at endoscopy. And thanks again to Pentax Medical for sponsoring our Endoscopy News podcast. Bye for now.